Welcome to this session on foreign and policy and security cooperation between the UK and the EU. My name is Patrick Winter. I work for The Guardian, where I write about international relations. And I just thought it's worth saying at the top that as we speak, Ukrainian armed forces are in action seeking to liberate their territory. And so what we're about to discuss is in no way an abstraction or something that could be confined to the seminar room. I don't think at any point has these issues been as important as they are since the Second World War. And to discuss what we are about to discuss are three speakers, one from France, one from Germany, and one from the UK. And I hope to shepherd them through a 40-minute discussion. And at the end, if you have some questions, you're more than willing conduit. The first speaker will be Nathalie Loiseau, who's a member of the European Parliament. She's chair of the Parliament Subcommittee on Defence and Security, former member of the French government, and she's just written a report on how Europe should respond to Qatargate. So she has many strings to her bow. The second speaker is David Lidington, who is chair of the UK's premier defence think tank, RUSI, and in a former life was a very distinguished Conservative MP, rising to the heights of the de facto Deputy Prime Minister, a position I'm sure he's very keen not to hold at present. And the third speaker is Roderick Parkes, who's the Deputy Director of the German Council on Foreign Relations and has just written the most scathing account of German foreign policy decision-making I've ever read. And hope to hear more of that in the future. Just very briefly, I guess what we're going to discuss is whether this issue of future cooperation is best retained in this current informal, bilateral, unilateral muddling through British format, or whether there's something would benefit from something more institutionalized, and whether that's politically feasible. And alongside that is the issue of whether our foreign policy cooperation is possible on the basis that we actually have shared positions sufficiently on issues such as transatlantic cooperation and China. And then I guess I'd love to know from Nathalie how she views Macron's view of European strategic autonomy on defence and whether there's place for the UK in that. Nathalie, if you'd like to start, you've all got ridiculously short time to speak to start with, but off you go.
Well, thank you, Patrick, and hello to everybody. Well, as you said, it took us a war to realize that between the EU and the UK, what unites us is more important than what divides us. Currently, we work closely together to support Ukraine and in our efforts to sanction Russia, and rightly so. The UK has been at the forefront of the military support to Ukraine and has shown the way. I have to say that the EU has gone through its own Zeitenwende and entered a new era in which we finally understand that soft power is not enough and if hard power is not present. So far, the EU and its member states have provided Ukraine with 14 billion euros of military support and is committed to continue for how long as it takes. The EU is also training 30,000 Ukrainian military. All of this was unthinkable even 2 years ago. In quite a pragmatic manner, we collectively managed to coordinate our joint efforts between the EU and the UK. The Ramstein format ensures that Ukrainian military priorities are properly addressed. And as regards the training of Ukrainian military, I know that British and EU officers do cooperate on the ground. We'll also do whatever we can to coordinate our sanctions packages towards Russia. But let's be honest, all this works only thanks to the goodwill of good people. We are still wasting time and energy to translate our common challenges into coordinated efforts. In other areas, we still have not recovered the level of coordination we had before Brexit. I'm thinking of Bosnia, where the UK left the Operation Althea, which was unnecessary. Currently, Turkey is in and the UK is out. I'm thinking of the Indian Ocean, where the UK is no more a member of Operation Atalanta. Nowadays, Japan is in and the UK is out. To my view, this is nonsense. And cooperating within NATO isn't enough. We don't know what's going to take place next year with the American election. And we have very specific European challenges to face. There is no loss of sovereignty in having a framework agreement on foreign policy and defense between the EU and the UK. It was even mentioned, as you remember, in the political declaration, signed by Boris Johnson and then abandoned by Boris Johnson. We fully understand, we Europeans, that Brexit reframes our partnership, but we should make sure that it doesn't make it weaker in such areas as foreign policy and defense. I hope that the European political community can become the place where we address these common challenges together, but we still have to work on it. It had a good start, but now we have to see how it goes, and we will see especially next year when the meeting will take place in the UK. And I leave it here.
Thank you, Natalie. David, would you like to pile in? Thank you.
Patrick, thank you very much indeed. And I agreed with a great deal of what Natalie has just said. It seems to me that we've got to face up to some existential challenges that represent a threat to the whole of democratic Europe and to the wider democratic world. I mean, most obviously and most immediately, there is Putin's aggression against Ukraine, where I think we all have to be absolutely resolute in saying publicly and committing ourselves privately to the need for Ukraine to win. That has to be our immediate objective. Any other outcome to this war will be seen globally as a strategic defeat for the West, for the democratic world, and rightly so. And it'll be coupled with Kabul, with Syria, with Libya, with Iraq, as evidence of what Xi Jinping talks about, that the West is inexorably in decline and other powers are on the rise. Secondly, we have to deal with the strategic challenge posed by China in terms of technology. I'm not somebody who thinks that you can somehow pretend to isolate the second biggest economy in the world, probably the biggest economy one day, much more integrated with global finance and trade than the Soviet Union was in the 70 years of its existence. And I think you need to have both engagement with China, but also a strategic response on technology and trade, so that by the middle of this century, we are not dependent upon Chinese know-how, Chinese supplies, and therefore Chinese goodwill for the key 21st century technologies on which our prosperity will depend. And third, we live with the reality now that we're seeing in the so-called, I don't like the phrase, the so-called global South's response to the Ukraine war, which is that we're living in a multipolar world where all kinds of different countries are looking for leverage to pursue their own interests now, don't want to be counted as in one bloc or another. Now, the lessons for Europe, it seems to be this, that democratic Europe needs to forge a new way of working together. And I was pleased that the integrated review new version published this year seemed to me to fill in the Europe-shaped holes that had been left in the 2021 original version. And that augurs well. So does British participation in the early meetings of the European Political Council, and the UK due to host another meeting next year. And I think that we do need a strategic UK-EU agreement. It shouldn't be one that weakens NATO. The EU is not, in my view, ever going to be a serious sort of hard military power. But I think the EU has and will continue to have hugely important soft power assets, whether its role as a global regulatory and trading force, or a source of investment that can help with reconstruction of broken countries, whether as the repository of democratic and human rights values, with a massive aid program. There are huge assets the EU brings to the table. So I want to see a strategic UK-EU relationship that complements NATO, and where we might look, for example, to one day European countries whom the Americans will expect not just to spend more on security, but to show greater leadership in places like the Western Balkans and Africa, where the US won't always want to take the lead themselves. The Europeans have the capability and the political will to do that. And my final point is that with some difficult questions, by the way, on defense industries, which I think one thing we will need to try to resolve together. But a European common approach, an effective European approach to defense, security, foreign policy is nonsense unless you're talking about both France and the UK being involved. Without either, there's a massive chunk missing. I see it, the optimistic future for me is one where we have a structured agreement and where a coalition of willing European powers is perhaps even one day able to use either NATO or EU assets and capabilities in line with the mission that they have got and advance our common interests and the democratic values for which we stand.
David, thank you. Roderick, please come in now.
Sure, thank you. I've got 3 points like David, but unlike David, I haven't learned to speak without breathing. So if I go on too long, then tell me to shut up. I mean, my first point, I think, is a slightly skeptical note. That just because we all agree that we can see the bigger picture doesn't mean to say that the differences between the UK and the EU are going to get smaller necessarily. It may turn out that because the stakes are higher, the differences get bigger. And I think we're at a sort of turning point here that we need to be careful that doesn't happen. If I look at the factors that have sort of put us on the same page when it comes to foreign policy and security, it's 3 things. It's firstly a new sense of economic security due to China's behavior during COVID, which I think put an end to the threat of the sort of regulatory race to the bottom and Singapore by the sea and that whole narrative around the UK. Secondly, of course, Russian action in Ukraine and a sudden appreciation across the European Union for the US. So that's slightly put to bed talk of European autonomy, or at least relativized it. And thirdly, I think electoral shifts and simply elections in the US, the UK, Germany, and France, which allowed all of these countries to make a sort of new start. I look at that at the moment, and things start to worry me a little bit. Firstly, the emphasis, I think, on economic security makes it tricky to cooperate. And I think from a UK perspective, there's the slight concern about being squeezed between 2 increasingly protectionist blocs, the EU and the US. Secondly, when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, in a way, we've had the easy decisions in terms of sort of giving away old stocks. Now we're facing the tricky decisions about what to invest in when it comes to armament, interoperability, autonomy, et cetera, et cetera. And thirdly, I think just this point that the bigger picture can supersize differences between reformist governments, or it can freeze them. And I think if you're a Macron, you're coming in for your final term and you put your foot on the accelerator. And if you're a Chancellor Scholz, you're heading a reformist government, but a reformist government that was prepared for the sort of status quo before Ukraine, and Germany is rather frozen. So I see trends, I think, a little bit that we may be pulling in different directions. Second point, I think we're beginning to see this play out potentially, and we need to be careful of this. So I think Sunak's visit to Biden last week pointed a little bit in the direction that the UK is perhaps worrying about this sort of being squeezed in protectionist blocs, and is maybe playing the defense and security cards to get closer cooperation with the US on economic side of things. I think from a French perspective, and Natalie, I absolutely defer to you on this, but if I was an Atlanticist president, which I think Macron is, then I would be fed up with the bad rap that I get. And I think I might start setting accents, maybe slightly at the expense of countries like Poland and Germany that sort of signal their Atlanticist virtues, but don't necessarily live up to them. So you might see a greater emphasis on the Asia Pacific, knowing, for example, that Poland is keen to have a grudge match with China, but in Europe rather than in the Asia Pacific. And I think from a German perspective, we're just seeing a sort of inward-looking government that's becoming increasingly frozen and is terrified by the prospect of a Trump in the US and a Le Pen in France. And you know, Le Pen as an example is in the German debates the reason to invest in Atlanticist security, and Trump in European capabilities. And if both of those eventualities scare the Germans, then they're a bit frozen. Last point, and then I'll shut up, is I think we probably can't get around an agreement. But I suspect from a German perspective, it needs to be about more than security and defense. And I have a horrible feeling it needs to be about the future of European order. And the question, what are we fighting for? Where does Ukraine fit? What relationships do we invest in? Who are our friends? How much EU autonomy and European autonomy do we need? The UK doesn't need to do that bilaterally with the EU, but it does need some answers to questions. And I think from a German perspective, there are three of them. Firstly, what is the UK relationship to Poland? If Germany is going to recover its faith in EU enlargement, then having a sense that Poland isn't a basket case and we can manage sort of taking in new countries is important. If the UK uses the relationship to Poland at the expense of Germany, then that undermines things. Secondly, and Natalie mentioned this already, I think the relationship between the UK and France and the European political community is important. And the deals that I think the UK and France made around not having EU institutions involved, I think Germany looks at them a little bit critically, would like to revisit some of these sort of bilateral deals. And finally, the UK relationship to Germany, and I think the sort of implicit agreement that comes out of the integrated compromise, which is that the UK does security and the military side of things, and Germany pays for reconstruction and the long-term side of things. And David, you hinted at this a little bit. I think from a German perspective is unacceptable. So all of these things are sort of key points, I think, from a German perspective that need to be revisited. Shut up, Roderick. Okay, sorry, Patrick.
Shut up, Roderick. Thank you for saying that. It was brilliant, all of you. And I just wanted to, if I could start now, I'm very conscious I don't want to cast Natalie in the role of spokeswoman for the French government, but
which I'm not.
Yeah, and tell me to go away if you feel the questions are coming in that direction. But I was just struck by David saying he didn't see Europe becoming a hard military power. And then I read the Bratislava speech by the French president, and although obviously it was an olive branch to Central and Eastern Europe, it also contained quite a lot of material about a strong European military power and about weaponry and about the need for greater defense coordination, which I know is something that people talk about and have been talking about for 10 years and never seemed to happen. But do you share that view that the EU will never become a hard military power?
Well, I think, as we know, military power is still very much in the hands of member states. But at the same time, we realize that if we don't coordinate, we spend a lot of money. We have a very fragmented defense industry, and we have military who are not used to train together, exercise together, and be on the front line together. So now there's a clear sense that we have to do more. We are starting from almost zero, except decades of beautiful speeches. But the reality was almost zero. It's changing now, little late. I hope not too little and too late. First, national budgets are rising in terms of defense budget, but at the same time, joint procurement, ramping up together with incentives from the EU budget. This was a no-go for decades. I was even taught when I was younger that it was not possible because of the treaties. Actually, it is. It's just a question of political will. And it's coming. Of course, it's coming because the house is burning, because there is Ukraine. But I do think that mindsets are changing. The real question is to make sure that people do realize that European defense is necessary as a complement to NATO, whether we have a friendly Joe Biden as American president or a not so friendly Donald Trump as an American president. It is necessary because there is this notion of burden sharing, which was repeated to us 3 presidents in a row. It's necessary because the US will continue to pivot towards the Asia-Pacific. It's necessary because, as was said before, Western Balkans or Africa may be more a concern for us than for the United States. So it's necessary, full point. And before the war in Ukraine, there was this notion that if we were trying to get mature, to become grown-ups in terms of security and defense, the US would turn its back. I think that now people realize that we need to be stronger ourselves as a complement, as a European pillar of NATO, and if need be, being able to do things by ourselves. That was striking, and David, you mentioned Kabul, and rightly so, because in the eyes of the global South, even if I don't like this expression, they have seen us leaving Kabul. They have seen us leaving Baghdad. They have seen us leaving Tripoli. Kabul, we couldn't even evacuate our nationals without the American help. So we were both grateful to the Americans, and it was a strong warning signal that we were too dependent. We were able to do it in Khartoum a few weeks ago by ourselves, out of coordination. So yes, there are progress being made, but if you expect a European army with one uniform and one general at the top, it's not going to happen. I'm not sure this is what we want to happen. There is no NATO army either, but NATO exists.
David, isn't it the case that many of these EU institutions that are slowly being built are exclusionary? They do not allow the UK access European Defence Fund, peace facility. And secondly, you're obviously mapping out the possibility of greater cooperation. But if you look at what's been happening over the last 2 years, it's been the UK making bilateral agreements with sort of the Netherlands, Germany, Spain. There doesn't seem to be an appetite inside the Conservative Party for what you're proposing. And given the state of the current Conservative Party at the present, is this in reality a discussion that's going to have to be held after the next election?
Well, I think whatever the result of the next general election, we're now at the stage in the UK where we're probably 18 months out. Probably less than that now, probably about 13 months out from a general election campaign. So you're getting into that pre-election mode that every democracy goes through as they approach the election deadline. But I think whether it's a Starmer sort of Labour or Labour-led government, or whether it's Sunak pulling off a surprise victory and therefore with hugely enhanced authority within the Conservative Party, I think there will be a greater willingness to look at structured relationships with the Europe, both bilaterally and with the institutions of the European Union. And I think the explicit words in the 2023 integrated review about cooperating with the EU, not just as the 2021 version generally referred to on a bilateral level with key member states, and in the 2023 version, explicitly referencing PESCO as in that context as well. That was a change. And I think there's a very clear signal there. I do think there's all, but I don't see, I mean, I can see some of the institutions being built. In PESCO, represents a change, but I don't detect any willingness to invoke the passerelle clauses in the Lisbon Treaty that would take foreign and security policy measures from unanimity to qualified majority voting. And if I'm honest, having seen Germany pretty isolated in the Foreign Affairs Council at the time of the Libya intervention in 2011, I find it hard to see how the big member states would put themselves in that position voluntarily, being outvoted by a QMV. And I think coming out of the Ukraine crisis, I mean, Natalie was right, and I think sense from President Macron, the emphasis on defense industries, and we do have to get this right. We've got to, in the view of the depletion rates of munitions, we've got to increase our defense capability hugely. But I think Poland, the Baltics, Scandinavians, the Romanians are going to be very wary of becoming dependent upon a wholly EU sort of defense industrial base when they've had experience of Germany in particular being very reluctant to give permission for weapons with German components to be used in Ukraine. And I think the question of interoperability in NATO, again, point towards a broader base. And so I come back to the fact it's in both sides' interests to establish, it would have to be a different version, but a new way for those European democracies that are in the EU and the UK, outside the EU now, and Norway for that matter, to and Iceland to cooperate in the face of these existential threats that we collectively now face. In my personal view, EPC is a good step forward. My personal view is I would like to see a UK-EU association agreement in due course. I don't think that's going to come overnight at all. And I would like to see the UK involved in some way with the deliberations that take place through Foreign Affairs Council in particular. And you go from one, most ambitious level would be UK sort of observer status and participation in those meetings. But perhaps you start off with projects. You start off with the Western Balkans. How can the EU and the UK work together there? How, when we're looking at Africa, can we cooperate better so that our collective efforts are more effective in helping to fight jihadism in Africa, fighting influence of the Wagner group in Africa? So probably build from the bottom up, but a structured relationship should be the end goal.
Yes, so sort of very pragmatic to start with and see where we end up in 2 to 3 years' time, possibly. Roderick, how much do you feel Germany wants actually even to be involved in this debate about the UK? At one level, the UK and Germany are really in different places, say, about the war in Ukraine. I mean, Scholz is probably the last holdout who's refusing to say that there has to be a victory for Ukraine. It's still that Ukraine mustn't lose. And I know those words in a way that semantic, but they're not, because they reveal something deeper about the future relationship Germany expects to have with Russia in the future. And the UK has really been a different place. Does that lead to a kind of a sort of restraint by Germany about having the UK on board more? Sorry, and if I could just also add, could you just talk a little bit to the amazing article you've written about the failure of Germany to be able to make decisions and the consequences? Because I guess that also adds to this sense of frustration inside the UK about Germany, that you eventually make the right decision after all other possibilities have been exhausted.
Okay, so I think part of your question, Patrick, is maybe a hangover from Brexit, and that sense of when David Cameron was trying to renegotiate the agreement with the EU. Germany did that odd thing of saying, sorry, or this is the wrong address, you need to go to Brussels and the Commission, and then what emerged the other side was rather a German-looking agreement. And this sense of, when is Germany hiding behind common institutions, and when is it actually Germany itself? When you look at von der Leyen, you say, well, that's a German Commission president, but she doesn't speak for Germany, and certainly not for her own party. So it's a complicated relationship. How much is Germany hiding? I think the trouble is that it's saying what it thinks its neighbours want to hear, but they don't really feel that Germany is being properly honest with itself, and actually they want something else altogether from Germany. So it's a rather sort of complicated game, and I think that the UK is kind of peripheral to that, to be honest. So I can't see who's in the audience, but I suspect it's mainly Brits who are interested in the UK-EU relationship. I think from a German perspective, the UK, even on security affairs, is relatively peripheral. A lot of it, I think, comes down to, in many ways, Biden picking out Germany as the sort of keeper of the special relationship, and sort of moving away from the UK, at least when Johnson was in power, and Germany just not noticing that. So the UK, I think, has very much noticed this and is praising Germany heavily for its readiness to reform, because it's terrified that isolationists in Washington will having Biden having sort of put all his chips on Germany, that there's that there's not enough happening in the end in Germany. And Germany, I think, just hasn't noticed that it has that role at the moment, that it is kind of the keeper of the special relationship, if you like. And I think this kind of brings me to the question of this article, that Germany just doesn't seem to realize how so closely it's being scrutinized, in particular by the US. And this thing of, as one of my colleagues, Ventalis, says, sort of moving at the speed of shame. So doing things awfully slowly, things that you know are going to happen, but moving so slowly that all the goodwill is kind of left out. I think Germany doesn't quite see the costs of doing that and what it's doing for the transatlantic relationship. That for me is the bit that's missing. But all European countries are kind of misreading relations, and I can come back to what the question you asked, Natalie and David, but I'll wait on that.
No, do so now, because it's ridiculous. We're going to run out of time. So
right, okay. I mean, if you're a watcher of relationships in the European Union, it's very interesting to see how isolated Germany is, and how other countries are sort of shifting around them. And Patrick, you asked Natalie about Macron's speech in Slovakia the other day. That to me is very interesting. I remember going to Brussels after Macron had said what he said on Taiwan, and at an absolute low point, you would think, for Polish-French relations. And talking to both the French and the Poles in Brussels, both of them said, despite ourselves, we find ourselves cooperating with each other because the Germans are dragging their feet so much on everything, in particular nuclear power. So you do see these relationships come, and Macron, I think, is very clever at building them. What worries me a little bit is, and I'll finish with this, sorry, Patrick, but Macron pursuing the idea of a Europe of concentric circles, so you have a core and then a periphery or several peripheries, and Poland and co pursuing the idea of a geopolitical enlargement. For me, that ends up putting Germany in the core. France has put itself in a second tier, and Poland in the third tier, probably. So even as they're teaming up, Germany is becoming more central thanks to their reform efforts. Anyway.
Brilliant, Roderick. Look, I've promised to let audiences ask a question, and this is from Mark English, and I'm going to read it out, and I've got no idea whether it's an intelligent question. I'm sure it is, or else no member of this audience would be other than intelligent. But given how important UK defence contribution is to both UK retaining global influence and to Europe's defence, should both UK and EU be open to a closer economic relationship for its own sake, but also to ensure a stable economic and political base for UK defence policy and spending? I guess in a way that is about the UK defence base. And so, David, could you try to answer that?
I think that if we're going to have a sort of European defence capability of the kind that we need, and also which is capable of providing the tools that would allow us to be less dependent on the Americans in the event of an isolationist administration, or the Americans just deciding we don't want to take the lead on this or that initiative, then it has to involve the UK as well as the EU. Now that does raise difficult questions for both parties concerned, because it offends against the sort of EU distinction, which I certainly understand, between members and non-members. And it would mean blurring those lines. And I agree with what was implicit in Mark's broader question about trying to rebuild a closer economic relationship, because we have sort of common interests and trade on digital as democratic powers in the world. But there are some big issues out there which the Labour Party is very shy of touching on single market and customs union there. And my view is that I'm perfectly relaxed about things like I'm in favour of veterinary treaty, SBS, agreements, that sort of thing, and it'll make sense to align with EU regulations on certain sectors, but that won't buy you automatically enhanced access to the single market. I'm not sure that I'm not sure EEA is right either, because I think it's very difficult to be to agree to be bound by rules where you have no say. But if you don't do that, then there's always been the logic of EU membership that certain privileges attach to membership and don't attach to anybody else.
Natalie, with not long left, can I put you in a difficult position and just ask you what you think will happen at the Vilnius summit in terms of the application from Ukraine to join NATO, and probably more pertinent, what will be the security guarantees that can be offered at this stage? Or do you think this whole discussion is kind of a bit crazy since we don't know how the war is going to end up?
Well, I think that we have to continue on the path of the Bratislava speech, that is to say, to recognize our mistakes. 2008, the Bucharest meeting where we said that we were leaving the door open to Georgia and Ukraine, and finally did nothing to provide them with any sort of security guarantee. It only triggered some more military adventurism from Putin. Now we have to work on current security guarantees and future security guarantees. Right now, basically, Ukraine is our security guarantee. Ukraine is making the Russian army weaker. So Ukraine is a security provider for Europe. And we first have to think it this way. Then we can build on the Kiev Security Compact, which was drafted by Zelensky's head of the presidential administration, EUUK, and former NATO Secretary General Rasmussen. They basically say the more we get weapons, the stronger our military is, the less dependent we are on others for our security, which I can understand, but at the same time, we don't know whether Ukraine will always be led by a leader like Zelensky. So we also have to make sure that security guarantees works in a common interest. I hear Macron being really willing to go as far as possible to not an immediate NATO membership, but very strong assurances. I see some more reluctance on the other side of the Atlantic because you don't invite a country at war. There is something like more than what we do with Israel, but less than a NATO membership for no one. Tonight there is a Weimar Triangle dinner between the Polish President Duda, Chancellor Scholz, and Emmanuel Macron, and they will have to put things on the table. I hope that at least we don't invent useless red lines as we've done in the recent past. I do regret that it took us so much time for jet fighters to be allowed to be provided to Ukraine. And I hope we realize that we are not only watching brave Ukrainians fighting a difficult war in Ukraine, we have an interest in making Ukraine win, and the sooner the better. So I hope we can accelerate what we are doing right now.
Look, this is deeply annoying and a product of my incompetence, but we've come to an end, and we've got three great minds here, and I could have definitely kept this discussion going for another hour and a half. Anyway, thank you so much, Natalie, Roderick, and David, for talking to us. And I'm now asked to tell you there's going to be a high-level discussion, and you should stay tuned. I've never known anything but a high-level discussion happen at this forum. So thank you again.